What happened to Homeworld 3? That is the question we are going to try and answer today, as it appears as if Homeworld 3 might have been ruined by one single DEI-obsessed writer from Gearbox Interactive, interfering with Blackbird Interactive's attempt to create a more traditional Homeworld 3. As we can see from a series of unused concept art shots from Homeworld 3 that not only appear to present a very different style of storytelling, but also a very different story overall. A story that looks a hell of a lot more like actually Homeworld. Hell, you can even look at the initial trailers and compare them with the more recent ones, and you will see a drastic change in focus, in style, and in story presentation. And chin size. So, how by Higara did this happen then? Well, let's start all the way at the beginning, shall we? The Homeworld series, of course, requires no introduction, with both the first and second game, as well as Cataclysm, initially intended as an expansion, being considered absolute cult classics to this day, with countless fans having now waited 20 plus years for the next entry into the Homeworld series. And initially, things looked pretty damn good. Homeworld 3 got a publisher in Gearbox Interactive and was fully funded and ready to go into development with Blackbird Interactive, which boasted amongst its numbers a fair few OGs from the original Homeworld. To make things yet more promising still, the developers launched a highly successful FIG crowdfunding campaign, where they also asked the fans of the franchise specifically what they wanted to see more of and what they had always enjoyed about Homeworld. And yet, despite all of this pedigree, despite all of this money, and despite an apparent genuine interest in making a game that the fans would want to play, Homeworld 3 arrived earlier this week and is barely holding on to a mixed Steam score with 45% positive. And having suffered through the entire campaign in one sitting, I can say for absolute certain that about 90% of that is down to the story and the campaign. For whilst sadly Homeworld 3 is in many ways a mechanically inferior game to its predecessors, which is tragic to think about considering aforementioned predecessors are 20 plus years old, but when it comes to general visuals, the graphics, the sound design, and the gameplay, it all holds up relatively well, but the story is the big disappointment. And not just in terms of how the game runs roughshod over previously established Homeworld lore, like how hyperspace works. Apparently, in Homeworld 3, hyperspace can be used to move objects even without the need for a drive or a core. Furthermore, hyperspace can now be used to communicate, apparently, and possesses a wide array of other powers beyond transportation. And yet, by the way, despite the Queen's seemingly incredible command over hyperspace, she still elects to send all of her forces against you down a single narrow approach tunnel when the game determines that it's time for a defensive mission. And let's not even get into the fact that her entire incredible mastery and weaponization of hyperspace could easily be countered via, hyperspace inhibitors. But again, the lore violations are not the main problem. It is the fact that Homeworld 3's story is not a Homeworld story. It is not presented as a Homeworld story. It is not written as a Homeworld story, and it certainly does not have any of the focuses of a Homeworld story. As in Homeworld 3, instead of a massive epic space opera with enormous and known stakes like the reclamation of Higara, for example, we get a very small and narrowly focused story that revolves near exclusively around 3 individuals. Imogen Sajet, the woman whose chin is so massive it can bend space and time, her intelligence officer, Isaac Paktu, and our antagonist, the incarnate queen, who kinda pops out of nowhere with a whole range of unexplained powers never before seen in the Homeworld universe, who appears to simply be the tyrannical, absolute ruler and enslaver of a vast part of the galaxy, apparently, and yet is also given a strangely sympathetic and touching send-off, with Karen Sajet saying that she will end her pain now and bring her peace. That's a weird way to end the story of Space Hitler on steroids, but okay. And this bafflingly lenient treatment of a character whose initial gambit and introduction to the story saw the destruction of entire planets and the murder of millions, if not billions, when seen along with many other little things, begin to form a pattern. Suddenly, we are seeing a lot of faces of characters, very diverse faces, in a series where, by and large, the crews of your ship and even your commanders were largely faceless. But alright, just a stylistic change to go along with the rather dramatic departure from the original storytelling style of Homeworld. Nothing too serious or implicative there, sure. What about our new main character then, Imogen Sajet? Well, initially, when we first saw her, she looked quite feminine, attractive even. But that was before, and now Imogen Sajet's most standout feature is, holy cow, that chin. On the bright side, it does explain why she has such mastery over hyperspace, as that thing surely must be the most super dense object in any room, and thus the bending of space and time to her will should be a facile feat. Taken in isolation, these 3 things might mean nothing. But when combined with a 4th element, the managing director of narrative properties, which is as made up a title as any I've ever heard, you begin to see a pretty clear pattern. As now I introduce you to Lynn Joyce, a Gearbox employee, which I feel the need to mention because Blackbird Interactive did promise during their FIG campaign that they would have full creative control over Homeworld 3, which does not appear to have been completely true. As during the writing process, the 2 main writers apparently passed everything by her, and she would point out things like when too many characters would refer to Imogen as crazy. And the writers would also say, I want to do this, but how can it be done better? With Lynn's feedback eventually hugely shaping Imogen's character as the story drafts continued to be refined. Refined is a very interesting word there, because in February 2022, Lynn Joyce was promoted to head of writing at Gearbox. 3 or 4 months thereafter, the first major delay to Homeworld 3 comes in. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean anything in and of itself. But Lynn Joyce is also then later promoted, or has her title changed, whichever, to Managing Director of Narrative Properties in May, well before the release of the next trailer, the one that looks so different. And now we also have both Lynn and the writers talking about how much she helped shape Imogen Sajet, the character whom the entire new story was to revolve around. It could be nothing more than a simple coincidence. Maybe the writers just really liked her ideas. Possible, but I would also point out that Lynn Joyce's responsibility, according to herself, was to manage Gearbox group of talented writers, which presumably also includes Blackbird Interactive's writers, as again, she was instrumental in shaping the character. And she was also responsible for maintaining the quality of writing. Now, whether or not Dr. Lynn Joyce is the correct choice for that, considering some of her previous endeavors, well, that's a question perhaps for another time, but this seemingly indicates that she had a fair bit of power, managerial power, over the writers, meaning that if she said jump, there is every reason to believe that they would have done so. But this is all simple speculation, of course. What about the other data points? Can they in some way be tied to Lynn Joyce? The incredibly diverse cast of suddenly faced characters, along with a evil but not actually really evil but rather misunderstood female antagonist, and Imogen Sajet's sudden face expansion. Well, there just so happens to be a certain political ideology, of course, which we've talked about quite frequently on this channel, that endorses all of these things. Diversity for diversity's sakes. Women are always strong and empowered, yet never actually evil or problematic, and who like to have their women look like men. And of course, progressivism and wokeism has a long history of interfering with established franchises. So, can Lynn Joyce be tied to this political ideology? The answer is hardly going to surprise you at this point. Yes, and quite conclusively so, as she used to write for a page called Critical Distance. The name alone will raise an eyebrow or two for those who are in the know, and when you add in mentions of climate justice, hate speech, safe spaces, and inclusivity, etc., you know exactly where this one's going. And just in case you want it hammered home with a hammer, well, there is also Critical Distance former senior curator Chris Ligman talking about curators are class enemies and her problems with cisgendered white men. Now, of course, correlation does not necessarily imply causation. Just because Lynn Joyce was in a position to heavily influence the story direction of Homeworld 3, and just because she used to work for a very politically strident website, does not mean that she brought these things into Homeworld 3. Not necessarily. But it's a little bit too big of a coinky-dinky-winky for me to buy entirely. Because if we do assume that Lynn Joyce is a rather progressive individual, then all of the changes to Homeworld 3 makes infinitely more sense. She would have been a woman in a position of power, both in her capacity as managing director of narrative properties, but also as a holder of a PhD, as an intellectual who knows all of the usual tricks within progressivism as well, to point out when the writers are calling a woman crazy a little bit too often, or introducing other unfortunate stereotypes into their writing, and who can help, just make an idea a little bit better. How could we, for example, make the idea of an evil invading space empire that is suddenly attacking Higara better? Well, how about making the Emperor an Empress? How about now making her a very misunderstood character? How about we add in that whole, oh yes, I'm freeing you from your free will, I'm taking up the burden of commanding you. That storyline, which we've only seen about 742 times in recent memory. And her presumed political background would also put her in the exact kind of mindset to be, we need more faces on screen. And we need those faces to be of a particular complexion. And we need more of a certain gender on screen. How about we find Karen Sajet somewhere, frozen in ice, where she's apparently been chilling for ages in an incredibly obvious and easy to spot location, with the mothership literally sticking out of the ice, and yet the enormous, numberless forces of the Incarnate Queen never found her. Until you, as Imogen suggests, lead them directly to her, of course. Which is exactly the kind of writing I would expect from someone who had more pressing priorities than making sure that the story made one lick of sense. Now there is another thing to be pointed out here as well, beyond simple just political involvement. You see, there is another mention where they state that they wrote pages upon pages for the script, and then in the end, only a single line actually remained due to the constraints of it being a video game. Well, that too sounds like the kind of problem that a PhD in writing might bring into the game, particularly with their focus on things. Because there's the issue. Writing for a video game is very, very different than writing for a book or a TV show or anything else. This is something that we have seen again and again in many other forms of video games and general entertainment. 40K, my go-to example for everything, is a fantastic and repeated demonstration of this, where one of the best writers in 40K, Dan Abnett, of Gaunt's Ghosts and Eisenhorn fame, has been asked repeatedly to write stories for video games. And they've always been awful. Or perhaps an even more strident example, Dan Abnett also wrote the Ultramarines movie. A movie that has become rather infamous in the 40K fandom for just how terrible it was, both in terms of its CGI and its writing. This is the thing, writing a book is not only different than writing a video game, it seems to be the antithesis of writing for a video game. And so as these writers were hammering out page after page of detailed dialogue, background, and lore they mostly made up out of whole cloth, and then needed to reduce it down to a single sentence, they took all of that presumed depth and complexity that they thought they were creating, wiped out 99% of it, and then were left with 1%. That was then tied into another 1%. And so, in the depths of their minds, there might have been an epic tale there, as we see sort of described in the Q&A interview with Lynn Joyce, where she is talking about Imogen Sajet and how she needs to stay true to herself while still navigating the challenges of becoming the new boss of the mothership. Okay, interesting. But is any of that part of the game? No. There is one cutscene at the very beginning where she wonders if when she's connected to the mothership, if she will still be herself. That topic is never really returned to at all, as she ends the story as pretty much the exact same person. Maybe a pinch more confident as she tells Isaac Paktu to shut up and get with the program. And even then, Isaac has always been her subordinate. He's always followed her instructions. And the entire idea that this is some kind of rivalry between the two, or there's a lot of conflict, which is mentioned again in the Q&A, really did not come across almost at all, if indeed at all, during the game. There might very well have been some kind of grand scheme here for how Isaac, how Imogen, how the Incarnate Queen would all have really deep and interesting character developments and personal stories that would weave together beautifully to produce something good. But when all you have is a minute or two long cutscenes to try and, get this idea across, you might not be able to, simply due to the limited nature of the medium. But there's also the thing. A good writer for a video game knows how to work with those limitations, as the medium cannot bend to the writer. The writer must bend to the medium. And even in a game like Homeworld 3 that's goddamn bombards your ass with cutscenes, they clearly didn't have anywhere near enough time to get across what they wanted to. In which case, they should have stepped back and thought to themselves, okay, this isn't going to work. Let's try something else instead of barreling on ahead and delivering a product that is kneecapped by their very own ambition to do everything in 30 seconds. And considering just how long this game has been in development, and considering the direct feedback it got from its FIG campaign, surely they should have known this. Surely the PhD in writing should have been able to put her finger on this. And, of course, I wouldn't like to put the responsibility entirely on one person here. I definitely do think that a fair few of the decisions being made about Homeworld 3 came from Lynn Joyce, as there are simply too many little coinky-dinky winkies that all make sense if one looks at it from the usual political point of view. But there were 2 other writers that she was overseeing that should have been able to make persuasive arguments as to why this was not a Homeworld story being created here, and why the fans of Homeworld might reward that with a very poor review score indeed. I'll leave it up to you all to make up your final minds on this. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.